Activist Leadership Program for Amnesty Canada. I'd like to start today just with a land acknowledgement. In a spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live and organize on colonized land. For all the gifts we receive from this land daily, we thank the diverse Indigenous peoples who are caretakers of this land today and whose ancestors have lived on and cared for Turtle Island for centuries. We also acknowledge our responsibility to care for this land while we occupy it. We recognize both the historical and contemporary harm caused by laws that are the legacy of colonialism, the connections between past and contemporary injustices, including the grave disparity between living conditions on reserves in the rest of Canada, and the failure of our colonial government to ensure adequate housing and clean water in Indigenous communities. We commit to embracing the collective rights of Indigenous peoples and to a sustained process of learning, unlearning, and actively dismantling structures and processes that maintain colonial power and white supremacy. We support all 94 calls to action as a way forward to decolonization. Thank you so much for being here. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Amnesty International, we are an international human rights organization with over 10 million members worldwide. We use research, legal work, and activism to promote and defend human rights around the world. Since we're having a discussion today, it's not just a speech, I want to start with a session agreement for safety and accessibility of everyone here. We will refrain from hate, discrimination, or harassment, including but not limited to hate, discrimination, or harassment on the basis of race, sex, gender, identity, disability, age, class, or religion. We encourage those of you who don't often speak up in public meetings to take space, be courageous in this space. Those of you who always feel comfortable speaking, maybe leave a little room for those who don't. Do what your bodies need. The room is open and flexible. All of the tables are movable, chairs. Make sure we center and value lived experience, and we come with an open mind and an open heart. I'm just going to quote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, which guarantees the right to adequate housing. Homelessness is an extreme violation of the rights to adequate housing and non-discrimination, and also a violation of the rights to life, security of person, health, protection of the home and family, and to freedom from cruel and inhuman treatment. Last year, Amnesty International issued a report on the criminalization of homelessness and poverty. So I will just move to introduce you to our moderator today. This is Bradley Lafortune from, he's the Executive Director of Public Interest Alberta.
Thanks, Kim. Feels like everything's happening all at once today. So I just want to acknowledge that I appreciate everyone making space and time here today. As Kim said, I work at Public Interest Alberta. I'm a community organizer here on Treaty 6 in Massachusetts-Skuykin, so-called Edmonton, so-called Canada. I'm really excited today because we have a really fantastic group of panelists. I'm going to do a short introduction of each of our panelists, and then we're going to have some strategic questions. Like Kim said, this is a pretty open space, and so we really encourage everyone to kind of center themselves and be present to talk about housing and human rights. If you have any questions or any comments you'd like to make, we really, really want to encourage you to participate. And hopefully it will be a good afternoon. We have a lot of time, so we're going to take things slow. I just wanted to say off the bat, housing for Public Interest Alberta has become one of our central issues under our theme of human services and poverty, because if you just look around in our streets in Edmonton, you can see the crisis that we're facing when it comes to housing. And that doesn't just mean a roof over someone's head, as we all know. That also means adequate housing. That means cultural adequacy, that means affordability, accessibility that we're going to talk about today, and a whole host of other issues. And so our hope for today is that we'll all come away having learned a little bit of something from each other about what the issues surrounding housing as a human right are, and what we can do. My job, I get paid to be an activist. So I'm one of those paid agitators and activists that Daniel Smith is talking about all the time, which is really fun. And I really think that we're all activists in our hearts. And I know that I've seen a lot of you on the front lines of a lot of causes and rallies and things as well. So I want to encourage us to think about what we can do as we're learning here today. So with us today, we have some of my heroes, actually. Jim Gurnett is from the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness. He's involved with education and advocacy on housing security issues with ECHO, that's the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness, and he's been working in the urban core community with the Inner City Pastoral Ministry for a long time. Thanks for being with us here, Jim. Next we have Judith Gale. She is the leader of Bear Claw Beaver Hills House, serving our brothers and sisters living rough in Edmonton for the past 4 years in a good way. And was, for the past 6 years, I believe, the lead organizer for Red Dress Day as well, which just happened last weekend, and a whole bunch of other stuff. We also have Joshua Evans. Dr. Joshua Evans is a social geographer by training and a faculty member in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the U of A. Joshua's research is focused on housing and mental health recovery, and for the past few years, he has been leading the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab, which is an initiative based at the U of A. And last but not least, we have Tonia, LaRiviere, forgive my French accent. She is the chair of the Accessibility Advisory Committee, AAC, with the City of Edmonton. She was diagnosed when she was just 12 years old with severe juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and it affected every one of her joints, leaving her bedridden and unable to participate in society as she used to. As an adult, she discovered community through the Stedward Center's Parasports Programming and Accessibility Advisory Committee. For the first time, she was motivated by acceptance instead of defiance, and now uses her experiences to contribute to the conversation and advancements in accessibility. So, we're gonna kick things off with a couple of strategic questions to get ourselves rolling. And we wanted to just start by talking about the biggest challenge facing us today when it comes to housing. So I think I'll just go down the line and pass the mic. So we'll start with you, Judith. What's the biggest challenge that you see when it comes to housing today? Just an easy one.
Yeah, sure, that's easy. Well, if we want to make it easy, then it to me, it comes down to us learning to be more human. You know, we're forgetting that we are made up of star matter, I like to say, and humanity. You know, we're forgetting our humanity, and I blame like our culture at large, right? Because we're into too much. We're going in the ego direction rather than the spiritual direction, and there's no balance. It's more ego out there than anything, and therefore man is being dictated by ego rather than spirit, and we need a balance, and that's it.
Well, that's a powerful foundation, I think, for the whole afternoon to remember what Judith is saying. I'll offer as the current most pressing issue in my mind something that's a bit smaller and more specific maybe, and that's this. For decades in Canada, there was a gigantic public investment to build what's called non-market housing for people that don't have enough money to afford what the for-profit market is charging. And billions of dollars were spent every year to do that in Canada for decades. And then about 35 years ago, that commitment started to change. And so people of a certain age, like me, remember that we grew up in Canada where there was adequate housing for most people by and large. But the challenge I see that we have today is that the majority of the voting population, the people that are deciding who our governments are are people who have grown up in a Canada where governments don't spend any money on non-market housing. And so it now has become normal to not have public money spent on housing. And you can directly trace with graphs that show the difference between the decline in public funding and the rise of homelessness, the consequences of not using public money to build housing. And so to me, the pressing urgent issue right now is that we have got to educate a whole generation of people who think that there is no reason for governments to invest in housing. We've got to educate them to understand what us old people know, that everything about the quality of life in communities is better when there's housing for everyone, and that it's quite normal and natural for government on behalf of all of us to invest in building that housing. And because we've lost that perspective, we don't have any support to our elected leaders to build housing these days.
Thanks, Jim. And maybe I'll just try and build on that point, Jim's point about the inadequate funding for social housing. And I certainly agree, and you really hit the nail on the head there. And I think what is also occurring simultaneously is that we're losing affordable housing in the private market that in the past was affordable to people on low incomes, but increasingly is becoming more expensive or is disappearing altogether as it's being demolished to make room for other kinds of development. So people on very low incomes, and we have those households here in Edmonton and in Alberta, it's increasingly difficult to find adequate housing because they're spending years on wait lists for the social housing that Jim was describing. And then the other alternatives they have in the private market are becoming fewer and fewer, and property owners and landlords can exercise more discretion over who they rent to. And this is becoming extremely acute here in Edmonton as vacancy levels are close to 1.5%. And this is directly connected to the crisis of houselessness that we see worsening in our city.
I'm speaking today from the accessibility perspective, but this isn't isolated to accessibility. I think the biggest challenge that we're experiencing is an attitudinal one. When it comes to accessible housing, there is a lack of awareness, a lack of knowledge. It doesn't hold the same space as affordable housing does. And so we're going to speak a little bit about that today, but there needs to be better education and awareness and a willingness to change. And when I talk about change, we're talking about advancing, and for some reason the status quo is still status quo, and we're still building barriers into our system as we speak right now, and this has to change.
Great, thanks folks. I'm wondering if we could maybe loop back also a little bit and talk about your experience, in the work that you do, and share your perspective on housing as a human right. Just take a few minutes to talk about that from your perspective. And we'll start with Tonia and come back down.
Thanks. Okay, so as you heard, I chair the Accessibility Advisory Committee with the City of Edmonton. And I do first want to thank Kim and the organizers for including the accessibility voice, because like I said, it doesn't hold the same weight in conversation and in awareness. We'll start with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It speaks of equality for all Canadians, and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was developed to ensure equal rights for those experiencing disability, including the right to housing. So how are we doing? Well, some sobering stats. The disability community represents the world's largest minority. 1 in 4 Edmontonians report having a disability. This is also a worldwide statistic. 99% of homes in Edmonton are inaccessible.
Alberta is one of only 2 provinces in Canada that does not have accessibility legislation. The other one is PEI. There is no federal accessible housing legislation. The Accessible Canada Act is a federal law aimed to improve accessibility to federal facilities, services, but does not address the rights to accessible housing. Accessible Standards Canada published updates to their standards to accessible dwellings in 2023, but because they aren't regulations, there is no requirement to follow them. The National Building Code, accessibility in residential buildings, specifically exempts detached houses, semi-detached houses, houses with a secondary suite, duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, row houses, and boarding houses from requirements, and is a barrier-free design sections. This example is also, or this exemption is also found in the provincial building codes. So we have a long ways to go. Maybe I'll just keep it at that for now, and then we'll move on. I think it's also important to recognize, though, that every single person in this room is going to experience disability. 100% of us. Those of you who have glasses, you may not realize it, but that's an aids to daily living. How would you function without your glasses? Do you have your independence? Likely not. So I think when we think of disability, we're thinking of an isolated group of people, and we tend not to recognize that that includes us. And when you do experience a disability, are you going to be able to live in your own home, in the community you grew up in, with all of your supports around you, or are you going to have to move somewhere isolated from your community, from the home that you grew up in, to where?
Yeah, so my perspective on housing as a human right, I think broadly speaking, I think housing is directly connected to basic human rights values. And, you know, foremost that comes to mind are things like dignity, equality, well-being, and, you know, the absence of housing is a direct assault on these basic values. So I think that's one broad way of thinking about human rights that comes to mind for me. I guess in my practice as an academic, you know, I spent some time thinking about how housing as a human right is actually interpreted, how it's applied here in Canada. And so in this regard, I think it's important to think about, you know, the strategies that rights holders are choosing in trying to realize their right to housing. In Canada, there tends to be two ways this is occurring: litigating through the courts using the charter as a basis for claims, and then the other one, which I'll talk about in a little more detail here, is the role of international human rights law. And this is important because it's become the basis for federal housing policy in Canada. And so, more specifically, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Some of you may have heard of this covenant. It's the covenant that covers or addresses housing as a human right. And it was created in 1966. Canada ratified it in 1976, more than 40 years ago. But it wasn't until 2019 when the federal government passed the National Housing Strategy Act that it was incorporated into Canadian law. But what's really important here is how it's been taken up in Canada. And so in that regard, the international law on human rights, you know, the way it's framed, it invites or encourages countries who have ratified the conventions to work to further the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. And that's a really important phrase because it can be interpreted in many different ways. Generally, it refers to the obligation that states use the maximum available resources to progressively achieve the full realization of the right to housing by all appropriate means. There's a lot to unpack in that language, right? The maximum available resources, using all appropriate means. And it's in these areas that states often fall a little bit short. But that said, there's also a number of different ways states around the world have taken up this obligation. Some countries have interpreted this and have passed statutory legal rights. So countries, places like Scotland, for instance. Other countries have opted for creating what are considered more programmatic rights. And these are rights that are realized through the creation of housing strategies or housing policies. And Canada, the federal government, the government of Canada has chosen this path. And so this is sort of the space within which international human rights law is being applied in Canada. And it's important to address this just to get a sense of how the international law is being mobilized or worked here in Canada. You know, one of the criticisms of this programmatic rights approach is that it doesn't lay out really clear remedies very often. And so I think it's fair to be quite cynical of the application of international law. I mean, it's been over 40 years since Canada ratified it, and while it offers all of this promise, you know, so far it has, you know, really delivered very little. But I would say there's still hope, because I think if you look at the National Housing Strategy Act, you look at the Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, there is still some really important things in there that allow us to hold our government to account. And in particular, I draw your attention to a few things. So, as a signatory, as a ratifier of this covenant, you know, the government of Canada is responsible for meaningfully engaging rights holders in conversations and in the development of policy. It's responsible for prioritizing those that are most vulnerable. It focuses attention on systemic barriers. For instance, the barriers in the built environment that prevent people living with disabilities from accessing housing. That's a systemic issue. And it requires the government search for transformative changes in these areas. And it also requires the government to seek these solutions or seek to formulate policies that move us towards the realization of housing as a human right in the shortest time possible. And so this is important language that we can use to in conversations about housing as a human right and in holding our governments to account.
Well, I'll maybe take a minute or two and say a few things about what's happened locally around the human right to housing over the last while, just to give you a sense that you're on the right track. This is an approach and a perspective to understand about housing and why it matters and what we need to do that makes good sense. Probably about 12 or 13 years ago, the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness thought that this might be a lever that we could use, and we met with representatives from the Alberta Human Rights Commission to see about being able to take forward a case or a complaint around housing as a human right, and it didn't take them very long to reassure us that there was absolutely zero chance that could be done, and that they just couldn't support us in doing anything like that. But we've sort of persisted, and about 10 years ago, ECHO put on a campaign here in Edmonton, and thousands of people actually signed postcards. We had tables at events around the city, and you could sign that you supported action by the government on the human right to housing. At the time, one of the members of Parliament, Linda Duncan, that the odd one of you may know, Linda went to Ottawa with a large box full of all our postcards and tabled them in the House of Commons to let people know that in Edmonton there was a lot of support for the idea of housing as a human right. And so it's something that we've worked at. Now, I want to also mention, and Joshua touched a little bit on this too, but the United Nations has been really helpful in this regard. For many years, the United Nations has had a special rapporteur on housing issues, and that person can go anywhere in the world, and states have to support them investigating issues around human rights. The special rapporteur came to Alberta about 8 or 9 years ago maybe, and the report at that time focused on serious shortcomings in Canada around the human right to housing, on settlements of First Nations, and like housing on reserves, for example, and wrote a pretty negative report that was tabled in the United Nations about Canada's failure to recognize the human right to housing in that context. And so this is a way of looking at the issue that I think we need to hold on to. More recently, you've probably noted in news coverage, news stories over the last 6 or 8 months that there's been a bit of a surge in interest in how people who are camping are treated. And that's probably it's a horrible thing, and what's happening is just heartbreakingly despicable. But in a perverse way, it's almost been helpful that there's been that attention to how people who are camping are being treated, because it's highlighted maybe one of the most dramatic abuses of human rights that's taking place. One of the helpful things that's come out of it is that there's a Canadian organization called The Shift that's produced some very good materials. They've produced a little guidebook for municipalities on how to, in municipal policy, honor the human right to housing. And so any city or town government can download that manual for free and get all kinds of really practical, legally correct ideas about what they can do. They also produced, and there's lots of copies, I hope you'll all take some, they produced this little leaflet that explicitly describes the human rights that are being violated when the areas where people are camping are torn down and the people are forced out. And so everybody should know this. When you see people being chased away from where they're trying to find shelter on public land, they're in violation of international and national human rights, clearly and plainly. And we need to be ready to speak up and defend that human right. And part of the reason they're able to get away with it, of course, is that they have immense resources. The police and municipal governments, and now even in Alberta, the provincial government, if they want to ignore the human rights of people, they have a lot of resources to be able to do it. And the people who are having their human rights denied have very few resources to try to counter that or to work against it. But flowing from the federal legislation that Joshua was mentioning, there is one very hopeful thing in Canada that I encourage you to be familiar with, and that's that we now do have a federal housing advocate based in the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and she's actually an Alberta person originally, but she has the resources at last, real public resources, to be able to take on human rights abuses that are related to housing. She's already put out some interesting reports and documents and research work on this issue. So look up the website for the Federal Housing Advocate and keep track and support what she's doing. One of the things she's pointed out, and I'll stop here, but one of the things she's pointed out is that none of the provinces have comparable legislation. Her office was created federally, but she can only speak to things where there's a federal legal component to them. And so every province needs to act similarly to create a housing advocate and to put housing as a human right into their own legislation for a lot more things to be able to happen. when before the provincial election last year, Echo wrote to all the political parties that were running in the election and asked if they would make a commitment to enact legislation to do that if they form government, and none of them responded that they would, unfortunately. So we need to keep pushing on that, because despite some good things federally, we have nothing to work with provincially yet around the human right to housing.
Goodness me, a lot of great words here by people with greater minds than myself, that's for sure. I'm not a high school graduate or anything like that, so, but I do have much lived experience, and as well I have a lot of experience being an Indigenous person. And as an Indigenous person on Turtle Island, I will say that prior to colonization, we had no unhoused people at all. For thousands and thousands and thousands of years, we lived on this continent without having one unhoused person at all. It was only through colonization that then we became a society that had homeless people. Well, I'll tell you, Indigenous people of Turtle Island are not homeless. It's an oxymoron. It's a misnomer. This is where the blood and bones of our ancestors lay. This is our home territory. The people that are homeless are colonizers, settlers, immigrants. Those are homeless people. But on Turtle Island, Indigenous people are not homeless. Now, having said that, how I would love to go back in time and find out, I know exactly how they lived like that. You know how they lived like that? They lived like that through spirituality. They recognized that that human beings are just the same as any other species, any other being on Mother Earth. We are just the same. We're not any better, like colonizers like to think we are. We're the most smartest species, but yet we don't allow our own a dwelling. It's like, it's an oxymoron. So what I would like to see done is that we take housing out of the hands of government, period. Housing should not be in the hands of government, because all government wants to do is monetize, right? Government's all about monetizing, making money, and data collection. For goodness sakes, we've gone from spirituality to the far spectrum, which is now like data collection, and that's human beings mining human beings. Gold is no longer the #1 trading commodity on the NASDAQ. Now it's data mining. It surpassed gold in 2015. That's because we're going in a different direction. And we need to go back to our roots as human beings and realize that we are all the same beings on Mother Earth.
Truth. Thank you, Judy. So just picking up on some of the things that we've heard when we're talking about housing as a human right, and the major barriers that we see, because one of the things that I often think about is, okay, we have this federal advocate, housing advocate that Jim spoke to, who is doing tremendous work, and I think she's doing a lot of brave work in calling out governments who are not really living up to their job of implementing the progressive right to housing. We have federal legislation that I think was passed, about 4 or 5 years ago. We have housing needs assessments that are done across municipalities in the province. We have a minister of, social and community services who says he's, making sure there's more housing builds starting than any other time before in Alberta's history. What else do we have? We have the Special Rapporteur's report from several years ago that identified some major barriers. We also have a lot of lived experience and wisdom that is speaking truth to power. we have all of us in this room. So one of the things that I find frustrating as someone who also isn't big-brained, or at least I don't feel that way, I don't have all the solutions, but with all of this institutional structure and capacity, and we have the federal government saying we're pouring resources at, this issue of housing, what are the barriers? Like, why is it that we are seeing such a challenge to implementing the right to adequate housing for all when we have all of these, systems and structures and resources that are explicitly directed towards solving this problem?
I'm glad you brought up the housing needs assessment, because the City of Edmonton just did one, and we, the AAC, we've had meetings with the housing department, with admin, multiple times to tell them about the need for accessible housing in the city. And this was well before my time, and probably will be well after my time on the committee. I've been on for 6 years and I have another 2 years. When we met with them, and when I say them, I'm one person, right? So I don't want that to represent all of City Admin and City Council, of course not. There was resistance. And so when they did this housing needs assessment, they said, okay, well, maybe we will find a need for accessible housing. And guess what? They found a very large need for accessible housing. And it was frustrating because when you look at the time, the value in our voices. So I understand that governments are data informed, but when we're talking about the right to housing, housing that everybody can enter in, that doesn't need data. That doesn't need to be informed by data. That needs to be informed by human nature, by compassion, by common sense. So when it comes to that delay, sometimes you just need to listen to the voices instead of relying on data to inform those choices.
There? Okay. That's actually a very consistent and aligned with a human rights approach, which is actually putting rights holders at the center of decision-making processes and listening to them and acting on their claims where violations have occurred. So, but to the question, which was why don't we see change happening? I mean, I think to answer in really broad brushstrokes here, I think there's two ways we can look at our housing system. And the first way is what we often do, and this is where most conversations center on, and that's that we have a housing system and it's broken and we need to tinker with it here and there and fix it. And that's a convenient picture, right? We just need to pass this policy or that policy to rebalance our system and address some of the disparity or some of the need. And that's a way of thinking about our housing system that's really predominated for the last I'd say 4+ decades. Another way of thinking about it, though, is that our housing system is working exactly as it's designed. It's functioning just as it should, or at least the way it's according to in a system of capitalism. The private market of housing is operating exactly as it should under market conditions. And when you start to think about it that way, you realize we actually have to transform our housing system into something altogether different. Not just tinker with it, but think about some deeper systemic changes to it. Which is difficult, because when you begin to go down that path, you ultimately and inevitably press up against some significant interests that are heavily invested in the status quo, the way things are operating now. And so it's a struggle, and a deep struggle. And so when we're hitting our heads against the wall because we haven't seen any change, I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that there's powerful forces that don't want this existing system to change.
And maybe I'll just follow almost directly on from there. I like to be critical of governments, as some of you probably heard me through the years. But I think on this question of why things aren't changing and why things can't be better around housing security, we have to also do some personal looking. One of the real challenges in almost any municipality around housing, non-market housing developments over and over is the issue of NIMBY. Sure, in theory we agree that there needs to be more housing for people that don't have a lot of money. Just don't build it anywhere near where I live. ECHO published a leaflet a few years back contradicting every cliche about having non-market housing in your neighborhood as untrue, with lots of research to prove it. But people still hold on to that kind of idea, and we have to look at how prone we are to shift the blame to the wrong places. We criticize people that are struggling with homelessness as if there was some personal failing of them but in fact it's reasons that we can directly document in public policy. The deinstitutionalizing of mental health in the 1990s without ever following through on the promises that were made at that time to put equivalent dollars into community mental health. Well, we didn't do it, so should it be surprising that we've got people that are struggling with mental health issues with nowhere to go? So those are things where we've got to look at our own attitudes and how, because we're not going to put pressure on government to do what they should be doing as far as wise or prudent use of public resources, if we actually don't mind too much that status quo that capitalism is providing to us. So we do need to do a little bit of that looking first. And one of the first things we can do is be better informed. I mentioned earlier in one of my comments that for 40 years we built an average from the late 40s to the late 80s. We built an average in Canada of 18,000 units of non-market housing with public money year after year after year. We don't build a tiny fraction of that anymore. And for many years, through the 90s and early 2000s, we built almost none. So a huge shortfall arose during that time. Well, we need to be informed about that stuff. So this is my little promo, the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness. Anybody can come to our meetings. We have an educational part of those meetings. You can learn more about what's going on these issues. There's great places online if you like using online. The Canadian Observatory on Homelessness has thousands of research papers and podcasts and so on. We need to be informed so we know what we should be demanding, what we should be asking for. The Affordable Housing Solutions Lab that this gentleman led for several years has great material available. So we need to get ourselves educated so we know that asking for real action to make sure that everyone enjoys the right to housing is not unreasonable, is not crazy. It's a very sensible idea with deep social and moral value and with actually huge economic benefits, even though it might seem like it is a poor use of money.
time. Wow, a poor use of money. I don't think that's a fair statement when we're referring to human beings. I think every bit of money we spend on human beings is definitely needed and warranted, you know, and it's not a waste. So what I really would like to see is a shift of consciousness. You know, we've got to get out of our heads, so to speak, you know, our ego up here. And we've got to realize that we are, each and every one of us on Turtle Island, we come here with a home, you know, already, in my opinion. And our home is this body that Creator has allowed us to use while on Mother Earth, you know, and that's our home. Each and every human being has a home. It's just society's measure of money, of accolades for building, all of this stuff. It's just, we've got to give everybody a home. Every human being on Mother Earth deserves a dwelling, and that's all. I mean, I don't know what else. We've got to give everybody a home. Every human being on Mother Earth deserves a dwelling, and that's all. I mean, I don't know what else to say. It's just so exasperating because, you know, we're all human beings. Every one of us, and that's really what the core of the matter is that we have to realize our humanity before it's too late.
Yeah, Judy, when you talk about everyone having a home in our bodies and on Turtle Island, and something that you said earlier about this idea of houselessness not existing prior to colonization, and going back to the experience that we had overlapping in the past year with encampment sweeps, I don't want to dwell too much on, you know, emergency shelters and encampments in particular, but one thing that I think we need to acknowledge, humbly, in my opinion, is that when we talk about the right to housing, there are communities that are far more impacted in an urban setting than others. And so when I think about Roland Road, I think about some friends that we made there who said, you know, I'm choosing to be here. I'm not homeless, I'm here. And I'm providing a service for my brothers and sisters. And so, you know, one thing that I remember, also one of our friends, Leilani, who runs that organization, The Shift, who is the former special rapporteur on the right to housing, said, every single encampment, every single camp is a human rights claim, especially in the context of inadequate shelter and housing. There's nowhere else for people to go. So I guess, you know, my question is, how do we as advocates and community, you know, educate ourselves and center our advocacy in good ways where the need exists most, and change our consciousness around this whole idea about, you know, what houselessness really is? Because I think NIMBYism comes up all the time in my neck of the woods, for sure. You know, I want there to be SCS, I want there to be housing, but I don't want it right here. So I guess, I mean, I'm all over the place all the time, as you know, but could you just, you know, maybe take some of those thoughts?
Well, you know, when I think about, sorry, hello? Oh, there we go, sorry. When I think about housing, I think about that we have plenty of, I don't want to say shelter because we all know what shelters are, right? But let's say, not shelter, what's another word for shelter? Not housing, a structure. We have many structures here in Edmonton that remain empty. Case in point, the EBCOR Tower. It's in the epicenter of our brothers and sisters who are struggling on the streets. And this building is the vein of my existence, honest to goodness. Ever since I've been on the street for 4 years, that building, I know, has been only 10% occupied. It's a building of 46 floors? And that building, since I've been on the street, and it's my understanding since it's been opened as well, and it's now owned by the city of Edmonton, and yet it's only 10% occupied. And every winter we have brothers and sisters dying beneath that building, you know, and that building is afforded lights, it's afforded heat, it's afforded security 24/7. It could quite easily house 5,000 people. Easy. But they just don't want to do that, especially for our brothers and sisters. They'd rather let them die on the streets and say, oh, well, they chose that. No, I'm sorry, they didn't choose it. The city of Edmonton chose it by not allowing them a dwelling.
Well, and that connects, you know, with an important bit of the work we do in the community around working for the human right to housing. You've got to beware of the messages that government is delivering to us. So, you know, saying, well, it's all an issue of supply, as Judith is mentioning, and various other things. I discovered or bumped into a really alarming, sneaky little bit of government messaging yesterday. And it's one more thing to start being alert to and watching. There was a news release put out as they tried to, the province put out a news release, like they try to do fairly often, to create the illusion of how much they're doing. You know, they like to announce the same dollars for housing at least 3 or 4 times over the course of a year, and so that people just reading the news think that's an awful lot of money, unless you go back and really carefully calculate that, oh no, they found different ways to announce the same money over and over every 3 months. Anyway, even more insidious, yesterday, here's what I noticed them doing. They put out a news release about, you know, 100 or 1,700 units of non-market affordable housing that would be built. And in the wording of that release, they have woven together that this is funding for housing and for shelters. Now, emergency shelters are absolutely not housing. I mean, many of us that work in the community see every day the absolutely terrible conditions of these places, in human and in violence. Anyway, what I'm suspecting that the government of Alberta is starting to do is to try, just like they've twisted messages so many ways around housing, is they're now going to want to try to make the case that we won't notice when money is spent on shelters. We'll start thinking that money is being spent on housing. There's already far, far too little being spent on housing, and if some of that is now mislabeled, relabeled, and it's used to pay for the cost of these terrible emergency shelters. Well, they don't call them emergency anymore, you see. Shelters are institutionalized now, like food banks. We should expect that, well, of course, if you're homeless, you need to be in a shelter. No, you don't, like we're all saying today. If you're without any housing, what you need is housing. You don't need a stupid mat on a concrete floor with strangers half a meter away from you on every side and no privacy. No, you need housing. So here they are, twisting the messages. And I think that was related to a larger point I was going to make, but it got me worked up again about reading that news release yesterday and seeing, that's the first time I can remember reading news release over where they have explicitly tried to create the that money being given for shelters is an investment in housing. And so it's another reason why we've just got to be so informed. And one of the things we could do is to support existing well-researched campaigns. ECHO right now is part of a campaign all across this country to try to push the federal government to build 50,000 units of non-markets of social housing every year for the next 10 years to try to catch up on the shortfall. Well, instead of us all, sending off our own little individual notes of outrage to our MLA, joining large organized campaigns like that is a good thing. Amnesty International should know that better than almost anyone. Go and sign the letter at the Social Housing and Human Rights Campaign website to support this large national campaign, and that way we make our voices stronger if we're going to try to keep pushing for some change.
Thanks, Jim. While we have the province of Alberta in the crosshairs, I'll pick up on your point, Jim. I think that announcement was, celebrating, I think, $66 million of investment in housing and shelter, which might sound like a lot. But as Jim was saying, it's really important that we look critically at these announcements and interrogate those numbers. If you just look at British Columbia, at their funding announcements in terms of the investments they're making in social housing, it's upwards of $250 million. So clearly, if we think about that direction from the international human rights law, the covenant I was talking about, about using the maximum resources available, clearly the government of Alberta is not doing that, not using the maximum resources available. And this is wrong from a human rights perspective. But to Bradley's question as well, one of the things that I'm really worried about, thinking about our city in particular, is that as we're growing so quickly, and as houselessness is becoming normalized in terms of its visibility, as we're increasingly being fed these messages about danger and safety and so forth, it's becoming more common or easy for people to look past that person they see sleeping in their neighborhood outdoors, or to put their head down when someone's approaching them. And I think what that does is it draws divisions and creates space between us. And I think that's really dangerous. And so, one of the things that a human rights perspective invites us to do is to acknowledge our common humanity. And on that basis, think about our relationships with one another, which I think is what Judith was really talking about as well.
I'm going to draw on a little bit of what everybody just said. I don't know if you all feel the same way I do right now, but I worry or feel that it's harder and harder to get truthful information. And I worry about identity politics and individuals being so staunch with a thought or an opinion that they're not willing to budge from that. So in terms of finding those campaigns that you trust, Amnesty International, that's a great start to learning about what the facts actually are, and being willing again to check in and where do you stand on the issue, and how staunch are you that you're so blind to the other side that it's detrimental. to yourself and to everybody. So, yeah, I guess basically just agreeing with the previous comments that the education does, you have to find that trustful source, and, you know, looking at your position in all of this as well.
Thanks, Tonia. So when it comes to Edmonton in particular, and we're trying to localize these issues of realizing, you know, housing is a human right. Jim's talked about some national campaigns. What can we do, this is for everyone, what can we do to inspire more people to take up this cause in, you know, an effective way outside of, you know, these four walls?
Anything except stay silent. Right? Because I feel like we're all busy, we're all tired, and that's kind of what we do, because for, you know, whatever reason, we just can't hold another thing in our brains, in our hearts, in our mind, right? But you have to. There's power in numbers. We need to be strategic in how we organize. We get what we organize for, I believe, or at least we try. I do want to say, though, maybe it's a little bit off topic, with the city council that we have and administration, we have been seeing some really excellent improvements to accessibility. And we are being listened to. And, you know, it's so easy to sit back and criticize governments, and we're all very good at it. But I think it's also important to give credit where credit is due. And in terms of housing, and I know, Jim, you have extensive experience in relationships. But there is a mayor's task force that's being developed on housing, the zoning bylaw, which should lend to increased accessibility and community vibrancy. This is a living document, so things will change in time. There's been small increases in inventory since 2021. There's an affordable housing strategy. We met with the city's housing project team, and they implemented some really excellent, and we were really pleased. We were really surprised. Accessibility updates to public or just supportive housing, nonprofit. So changes are happening. It's slow, but we just need to stay on it. Because otherwise things aren't going to change. It's the people have the power.
I think when it comes to actions we need to take, I think it's first important to acknowledge that we can't or we won't realize the right to adequate housing without a larger social housing sector. Here I'm talking about nonprofit housing, cooperative housing, housing that's based in community. And also, we can't realize this right to adequate housing without an adequate income support system. And this is something that, you know, comes up sometimes in housing conversations, but is so vital and important. And our current systems that provide income supports are totally inadequate. And without both of those, we're still going to see significant houselessness in our city. We know from the evidence that, you know, places with higher rents at the bottom of that rental market have higher rates of homelessness. We know that from study after study. And even studies that have used the data here in Canada and Alberta have shown that rental costs are a key determinant of the level of homelessness. And so we need to address the low incomes in our community and the shortage of affordable housing, both of those at the same time. So when it comes to actions, it's how can we calibrate and coordinate our actions to really press on our governments to make these needed changes. I think that's really vital. I guess as well too, more at at the level of our own neighborhoods. I think as these bylaw changes have gone into effect, we're going to see changes at the neighborhood level, and that could include some new community housing coming to your neighborhood. And I think we need to become advocates of that housing, because that NIMBY attitude and response is still so strong. There may be less ability for NIMBY actors to block a project today with these new bylaw changes. However, those attitudes and that resistance is still going to be there, and so I think we still need to help with advocacy in that regard.
When I think about this question of what we can do, the first thing that comes to my mind is to remember that, and I think one of my colleagues said it a bit earlier, the way things are now is not by chance. There are those who benefit greatly from the current situation with housing and are completely content for nothing to change, or for things to even move further in the directions they're moving, the increasing control of rental housing by large investment forces and things like that. So we've got to understand what we're up against, and to not underestimate how strong the forces are that don't want the kind of recognition of the right to adequate housing for everyone that we're here gathered today to talk about. And they do it by creating fictions that we end up believing because we don't necessarily have the truth. Over and over I hear talk about the housing crisis, that we've got a crisis in housing or a crisis in homelessness. That's garbage. We have a crisis is something unexpected, that you can't prepare for, that comes on you out of, like a wildfire or a flood. What we have is a disaster that's been allowed to progressively build in this country for the last 40 years. And the people that benefit from it have got away with it. So we've got to start, if we're going to do something about this, we really have to start being outraged by it and standing up and saying, no, this is unacceptable, this is unnecessary, and we want to see change. I mentioned earlier, governments of all political persuasions demonstrated that they could do things in a much fairer and more dignified way for a long time in this country, and we didn't have the problems we've got with people unable to afford housing. Most or many of us may live in relatively comfortable circumstances, but the city of Edmonton tells us from their own research, almost 50,000 households in this city are in core housing need. That means they're either spending way too much of their available income to have housing, or the housing they're in is unhealthy, inappropriate, inadequate, insecure, flawed and inappropriate in some way or another. Well, that's a lot of people who are our neighbors, who are our sisters and brothers that are in danger. They may still have some kind of four walls and a roof around them, but they don't really have a place where they can create a home. And so I think the first thing to do is to get really upset about this and to not say, oh my goodness, an unexpected crisis has arisen, but to say there are forces out there deliberately for their own profit and advantage, allowing thousands of children and women and men to live without the dignity of decent shelter.
I will tell you that the status quo has been kept, right? And it's definitely, I always say that Indigenous people on Turtle Island have always, we've always been in a housing crisis. You know, we have always been in a housing crisis. Even when we go on reserve, you know, we're denied housing, even on our own reserve, which is ridiculous. And all because, you know, and we every reserve has land, you know, but yet people always want to leave the reserve and go to the big city to look for housing, if you can believe it. And why can't we just pitch up a teepee on our own reserve land and live off of the land? Why can't we do that? You ask Canada. Ask Canada, why can't we do that on our own reserve land? You know, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So what we need to do, like I said, is take housing out of the hands of the government. We need it to be a right for everybody, a human right for everybody. So what that looks like, I really don't know yet, but I mean, let's just take it out of the greedy government's hand. You know, they just want to figure out how to make money off of the backs of everybody. That's what I think. And so, you know, they're trying to make money off of housing when it's actually a human right. It should not be monetized. The only time, like, I mean, we live in a society where, you know, if you work hard, you can reap your big rewards and blah, blah, blah. That's the big myth out there, right? Well, I mean, Indigenous people have been working hard since time immemorial. But because the government doesn't allow us housing, you know, and the reserves, the Indigenous people have kind of resigned to that. And so therefore now the government is going down the line. They've taken out the Indigenous, now they'll go to the regular people, and then it'll be, you know, once they've got the regular people out of the way, then it's going to go up to the people that have means that will be then taxed more money. And you know, do you know what I mean? It's just going to go off the Richter scale if we continue in this fashion. So we have to really take it out of the hands of the government and say that this is a human right and each and everybody needs a dwelling. And even after we've done that, our brothers and sisters don't only need a dwelling, but they also need assisted living. You know, where we can't just, we've done that time and time again, where we've given our brother or sister with addictions housing, and it just comes up bad all around because they don't have the tools to properly take care. So we need to assist them, help them however they need, you know, and that's all we need to do. It's, to me, it's so simple, just to help one another. That's it.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. I always think, you know, tying this together, we hear time and time again, like from politicians mostly and other people who are in positions of power, that it's really complicated, you know, and we can't do it right now. There's also this trope that I always get all the time where they say, like, not us, them, and you go to them and they say over here, and it's like that Spider-Man meme where everyone's just Spider-Man pointing at one another. There's one, you know, like, you know, people like to say there's one taxpayer. There's also, you know, there's different levels of government, but there are different orders of government, but there's government, right? And we have one problem here. And I'm just so sick and tired. So I'm so happy to hear this energy of saying, you know, the first step is getting mad, righteously mad, and also not accepting that the status quo is inevitable or there's nothing that can be done. And the other thing, I feel like we've been, just because, you know, I like doing reading lists a little bit, but I feel like we're invoking a little bit of Ricardo Trangen's book about the tenant class and the idea that this is not a crisis. The system is designed to work this way. to exclude certain communities and individuals from it so that people can profit in different, real estate sectors, etc. It's operating exactly how it's designed to operate. It's just getting more efficient at extracting wealth. So if anyone's interested, that book's a really good book, The Tenant Class. We have about half an hour in the room here, and I kind of want to, as a first step to advocacy, invite everyone to come into the conversation. You don't have to use the microphone. There is a microphone there if you'd like to. But I'm sure we'd love to, just open the circle and hear about any questions or thoughts that people have for the last half an hour, based on, what we heard from our panelists today. And I want to say thank you so much for just all that great food for thought. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Who should take care of the housing?
Who should take care of the housing? That's a great question.
Yeah, well, I would envision something like what my ancestors would have done, in my opinion, and that would have been to use it, call a big community meeting, and as a community decide who is the most vulnerable and how many houses, and appoint houses to everybody. That's what I would think was done back in the day, and also put up laws that supersede a housing privatized law or something like that, where no government can supersede, no police can supersede, no, it's a unwritten law, if you will, that everybody gets a dwelling, and you're not, what's the word that you use when you're evicted. You're not evicted for anything, that a group, say for instance, you were playing your music loud or yelling at your kids, or, disturbing the general public at large. So then you would have a committee of people from the community that would come to you and say, hey, Judith, lately we've been hearing that you've been playing your music too loud. Maybe you can turn it down, and then we just do, we work together. We have an open dialogue. We have honesty. We have openness to live together, and with that kind of thinking, anything is possible. You know what I mean? Once we're all on the same page and able to think the same.
I guess my thought on it might sound like it's kind of in disagreement with some of what Judith is saying, but I think her point about how we live together with everybody having housing is really important, and I entirely agree. But in the circumstances we're in today, with this gigantic shortfall of decent housing for so many people, and given the cost of building housing and the complexity of human settlements, I really think that the leadership overall has to still come from governments, because only governments have access to the money to build non-market housing. The for-profit sector will always build the housing it wants, and that's what it's created to do. Like Joshua mentioned earlier, it's created to make money for its investors, whether small or large. So it'll do what it needs to do. It can be forced to make some accommodations, some modest accommodations, by legislation. So that's one role for orders of government. And then the other role is to say, for all those people who will never be able to afford the market, that housing has to be built by all of us together. And the way we do things for all of us together just like roads, is with the pooling that's possible from the money that governments have. And so I think if we're ever going to catch up the billions of dollars of investment that are needed to ensure decent housing for everyone, it's going to require governments making a big investment. And some of that simply is shifting. Right now, huge amounts of money are spent to deal with the consequences of the disaster that we're in. The city of Edmonton spent nearly $3 million last year just tearing down campsites of people who did have places to be housed or homed. And so public funds can be available to do this work. We proved it for a long time. CMHC, Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, some of us of a certain age will remember, it was created to do this. It's shifted to become a funder of large developers now, primarily, but it was created originally to let little ordinary families and people all across Canada be able to have decent housing.
To build on that, I think history can be instructive. So if we look back at the 1970s, when a majority of our social housing was started and built, as Jim was referencing earlier, and if you look at a province like Alberta, or Edmonton in particular, between 1971 and 1980, there was close to 3,000 units of community housing built in Edmonton, which is significant for the size of the city at that time. And at the end of that decade, there was an adequate amount of non-market housing. If you ask why were we able to do that, well, as Jim was saying, there was a strong support and leadership from the federal government with CMHC and low financing or low affordable loans. There was the Alberta Housing Corporation leading the development in not only Edmonton but in other cities across the province. The municipal government was playing a strong role in providing land, in coordinating public land assembly, right, which is something we don't see as much today, but which was absolutely instrumental in creating communities like Mill Woods, for instance, which is really interesting. Our land development occurs in a completely different way today. So that example shows how all three levels of government work collaboratively to produce a significant amount of non-market housing, a majority of which is still in existence today and comprises a core part of our social housing sector. So I think in ways we need to look back at that period and look to the success of that period, but then also maybe think about going beyond that, taking that further today.
I have nothing to add to that.
Other questions or comments?
I had a question, one on the panel. I comment on the current federal government policy to reduce immigration programs because of the pressure that is on the housing market, and it just seems to be a very short-term solution of giving student visas and cutting back on immigration.
We can't hear you.
Sorry?
We cannot hear you.
I'm sorry.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, sorry. Now, I was just asking whether the panel would like to comment on current federal government policy to reduce immigration programs and numbers of immigrants because of the current pressure on the housing market. And it just seems to me that it's just a short-term solution, and just not issuing student visas and so on is not really going to help much. And as the panel keeps saying, the government has the resources to find these kinds of housing for new immigrants just as much as for current Canadian permanent residents and so on. If you want to comment on that.
Jump in first, Josh.
Well, I mean, personally, I think immigration and immigrants are a convenient scapegoat for, explaining our housing situation, and so I don't find that pointing to immigration to be that helpful, and especially in some cities in Canada where we have significant amounts of unoccupied, unused housing, right? And so supply shortages. There's some important debates to be had about supply shortages, and Jim referenced that a little earlier. But I think importantly, we, from the perspective of human rights, we have to be aware that newcomers are actually very vulnerable in terms of housing insecurity, vulnerable to losing their homes, becoming houseless. And so, they also, regardless of their status, have housing rights, and so I think that's really important to be mindful.
Well, that's the number one demographic that we see on a rise in Edmonton shelters right now. At our WEAC Center, which is for women, the whole second floor of that center now is dedicated to refugee women. And that's deplorable. And at least 75 Ugandan refugees who just got to Canada 2 months ago, guess where they're living? They're living at the Hope Mission. Yeah, can you imagine that? We take them out of their ground zero only to put them in our ground zero. Deplorable. For shame, Canada.
I mean, the absurdity of it is evident when you understand what we've just said and what Michael has highlighted here. So we have a nation that fails for decades to do what all the available information says it should have been doing, continuously, methodically building enough non-market housing to make sure that there's housing for people that don't have much money. We failed to do that for decades, and then we blame some completely unconnected party for why there's not enough housing for everybody. So the absurdity of it just is hard to ignore.
Yeah, because Laurel, generally immigration should increase over time. That's been the policy for a long time. As we get older and we need people to replace.
Well, I was going to say that the labor market research all says we need to bring as many or more than we're bringing, and yet then we say, oh, we can't bring them because we don't have housing for them.
Yeah, it's absurd.
Great question, thank you. I've got like 20 more questions myself.
I've got a question from.
Yeah.
I've got a question from one of our Amnesty Edmonton members. She wants to know, can you speak about the connection between being unhoused and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirit individuals?
I will definitely take up that question. So it's no mistake that there's a correlation between housing and our missing and murdered. There's no mistake there. Why it's happening, we all know why it's happening, and I believe that's part of the ongoing genocide that this government, and not only this government, all the previous governments before have all blood on their hands, just as this government does. And it's because they feel, I can't say how they feel, sorry. What I have to say is that the way I feel, it's just a continuous annihilation of our people. That's what it is. They just want to get rid of our brothers and sisters, period. That's it, that's all. I mean, for goodness sakes, I had a gentleman tell me just yesterday, as a matter of fact, when I was out in the community, he was complaining to me about how the police are taking everybody's belongings, that they're only allowing people to have one bag, and if they see a person with more than one bag and a shopping cart full of stuff, or they're even targeting, if you can believe it, those baby carriers, you know? If anybody has anything that has more than one bag, the police will go and take everything in that shopping cart, because they're using the justification that, oh, it's a shopping cart, it doesn't belong to you, therefore it's stolen. You're in possession of stolen property, so everything in that shopping cart is ours. We're taking it, we're confiscating it, no matter what you tell the police. I had a lady tell me she had all her ID in her purse and everything that she had just gotten, and the police wouldn't give that to her. They took everything out of her shopping cart and took the shopping cart, you know. And a brother, like I said, just yesterday, he told me that, you know what they told him? They told him that if he didn't like it, he could move out of Edmonton and go back to where he came from. If you can believe that. You know, this is the absurdity that is going on with our brothers and sisters right now. And if we allow it to go on with them, guess who's going to be next, people? You know? So we've got to, well, anyways, I believe I have to stand up for my brothers and sisters' rights. I have to shout at the top of my lungs and let them know that what they're doing is just inhumane. Period. You know, I was up against 7 cops here the other day at Mary Burley Park, for goodness sakes. A park that, I'll tell you, does not get utilized by the general public. It's usually just our brothers and sisters at that park, because it's in a precarious little area, and as well, it's Mary Burley Park. Mary Burley was one of the great humanitarians of Edmonton. So, and it's a beautiful little park, and the police went there because there was an elder gentleman, an Indigenous man, 67 years old, who found himself unhoused. His wife became sick. They lost their apartment. She's in the hospital, and he's got no place to go, so he's got a tent. He bought with his last money a tent, he says. And so he was sleeping in his tent in the park, as well as a little sister who was so exhausted that she fell asleep on the picnic table. And can you believe it? They sent 7 cops. 7 cops plus 3 big trucks of to take all of their belongings. So all of this because, you know, they were treating our brothers and sisters like public enemy number 1, just because they wanted a shelter, just because they wanted some reprieve from their day. You know, anybody else in Edmonton can go to a park, put a blanket down, and have a book, and maybe have a little read, and then a little nap. Nobody's going to do anything. But because it's our brothers and sisters that don't deserve a house, they don't deserve to sleep either. They don't deserve to have a shelter either. Isn't that deplorable? And this is why I say we have to take housing out of the hands of government, because they send in their government goons to disrupt our brothers and sisters trying to get a human dignity. Every human being on Mother Earth needs to sleep.
When I just want to jump in there, Jim, really quickly. Last weekend was Red Dress Day, just last weekend. And, you know, when I think about solidarity being, you know, a union guy, and I think about building bridges across communities, I think about how important it is for more people from different communities to show up to Red Dress Day and to other events to show solidarity and strength across communities in Turtle Island. And I want to thank you, Judith, for, you know, teaching me and for teaching so many people and for being such a tremendous leader in our community, and giving voice to, you know, the voiceless in so many different spaces. And my request to everyone is, when we talk about housing as a human right, when we talk about harm reduction, when we talk about Mary Burley Park, when we talk about police violence and the overabundance of police resources that are, you know, violently confronting elders in our community, that we need to show up more and more and more on those special days and every single day in between. And so if you're interested in Bear Claw, I'm sure, you know, and other ways to get involved, because, you know, none of us are free until all of us are free. So I just, you know, I feel compelled to speak from the heart and say that.
I just want to add one more thing, and that is that it is getting worse. You know, we think that we're knee deep in it right now. Let me tell you, it's going to get worse. Every day in the past month, I get a call from family, people who are newly unhoused. Help, we've been evicted. Help, we don't have a house anymore. Help, the government has put us, me and my 5 children, up in one hotel room and only given us $46 to feed ourselves with. Like, you know, and this happens every day. I'm getting phone calls from a new family every day, because families are the #1 demographic on the rise right now. And why? And what's even worse is that Calgary has 2 family shelters. Edmonton has 0. And we shouldn't be putting families in one hotel room. You know, it's a shopping ground for sex trafficking, in my opinion. You know, for pedophile rings to go to a hotel that they know that the government, you know, and it's just an awful place for families to be, amongst with, you know, people that are doing drugs in hotel rooms, people that are like trafficking, like all of this stuff, and we're putting families in with them. That's not right.
In some ways, coming to this focus on the horrible consequences of homelessness, of having no housing at all, is good at the end of our time. And I just want to not to take away from the evils of the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous girls and women, but to just broaden it a little bit. One of the messages that I have had through the years is the idea that the end point of not having decent housing is that homelessness kills. And not just the violence of murdered and missing Indigenous girls and women, but in so many other ways, deteriorated health, mentally and physically and so on. One of the things ECHO does every year, and it's coming up in just a couple of weeks, ECHO holds a memorial service at a little park right across from City Hall for the people who have died because of homelessness in Edmonton over the years. When we started this memorial service about 15 years ago, we were able to identify in the previous year about 35 people who had died because of homelessness. And we thought that was just heartbreakingly awful 15 years ago. When we gather on June the 6th this year, and hopefully some of you will be able to come and join us, when we gather this year, we'll be remembering more than 10 times that number of people for last year's count. So the final price you can pay by ignoring the right to decent housing is to die because of it. And in Edmonton, we're going to be remembering not the 35 people that suffered that fate 15 years ago, but 10 times that many people in 2023. So we really need to be active to do something about this.
Great. I'm going to attempt to wrap this up, but I just wanted to see if Josh or Tonia had any final remarks about, I guess, what's the one thing you hope that people can do as a result of our conversation today, or even just take away.
I think if all of us could take away this, just the desire and the commitment to take action, whether it's attending Red Dress Day next year, whether it's doing some own personal learning, seeking out some of the materials that have been referenced today, attending Memorial in June. I think that would certainly be one important takeaway. But then also, I think this conversation about housing rights is a conversation that's ongoing, and a conversation that is still open and unfolding. And so I don't think anything is settled by any stretch of the imagination in terms of what housing rights mean. And in particular, one thing that's come up today is, the relationship between housing rights as I define them under international law, how those are being applied in a country like Canada, a settler colonial country, how those relate to Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty. These are all big questions that we need to think about in the spirit of addressing this crisis and in the spirit of reconciliation as well. So.
My brain and heart are full and overwhelmed. I guess what I would like everybody to take away is recognizing, of course, the need for accessible, suitable housing, which also is affordable, but expanding on that, and what does that mean for you and your family, and be loud about it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for sharing your afternoon with us and for reflecting on your experiences and sharing your expertise. Obviously, this is an evolving and ongoing conversation, and I think that's one of the biggest takeaways for me is that this is a conversation that we'll build on together in community, and will probably be something that we'll be getting loud about for a long, long time. But there are solutions, and there is wisdom, and there are opportunities for us to make change. And like you said, it might be slow going, but you've seen incremental change on the accessibility conversation at the municipal level. We know what we've been able to do in the 60s and 70s and 80s in Canada when it comes to social and non-market housing. And we have a lot of wisdom in the room when it comes to or even conceptualizations of what houselessness is. It doesn't have to be, you're housed or you're unhoused. And so this has been a really, enlightening and rich and, beautiful experience for me today. I hope you learned something. Thanks to all the panelists for being here today. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks again to all of you for coming today. Just wanted to let you know a couple of things. If you want to read Amnesty's report on decriminalization of homelessness and poverty, here's the code. You can scan it to download the full report. We have a table over in the corner, and we have some pre-written letters on a couple of issues related to housing as a human right. So I encourage you to pop over there and sign a letter before you leave, or take it with you. If you want to sign it here, we'll mail it for you. You don't have to pay for the postage. I also want to let you know, we have Heather here has been taking notes during this whole meeting, and we have recording as well. We're going to share the notes amongst all of us here up front and try to bring them to some sort of concise little summary and maybe head towards a plan of action. And so if you're interested in seeing that summary and looking at ideas for a plan of action, please leave your email address with us at the Amnesty table. Okay? All right. Thank you very much, all of you, for volunteering your time today. It was amazing.